Today, I will be your chair for this panel. This is panel C4 on Conceptualizing Human Rights in Africa. And I'm Dr. Céline Jacquemin. I am a professor at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas, so not coming from as far as many of you. I'm a professor in both international relations and political science. I am also the Associate Dean for the Humanities and Social Sciences there. We have a really great panel for you today. We are going to go from conceptual debate over dignity and some of the social order. We'll also look at a historical analysis of human rights violations. We will be going beyond social relativism about human rights and have a philosophical analysis of human rights in traditional African society, as well as questioning human rights in the context of development, and ending with our last presentation, which will look at human rights in the context of democratic governance. And we will be specifically visiting areas of Nigeria and then coming back into Central Africa. So welcome to all of our presenters. I will now turn to our first professor.
I have known over the years that sometimes the first presenter can set a good or a bad tone in terms of time allocation. And therefore, I shall commit myself to the protocols of presentation that you have laid out. So what I want to do is mainly to sum up and discuss the central argument in my presentation. Maybe offer one or two empirical data to sustain the broad thrust of my presentation, and then make some conclusions with perhaps one or two observations. I have been particularly disturbed over what has been happening on the African continent. I mean, in my own country, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Uganda, Malawi, and I appear to be drawing the conclusion that though we may occupy the same geographical boundaries in our respective countries, we do not share the same space of intellection when it comes to conceptualizing human rights. And I think as scholars who study human rights, we should do more research about how human rights is conceptualized beyond the academy. Because there are two important spaces of conceptualizing human rights: the academic space and the public square. The academic space is also an urban space of thought. And very often human rights are conceptualized in the safe refuge of the ivory tower, particularly in the books that we write and in the peer-reviewed articles that we submit to journals. I argue that in the urban academic space of human rights discourse, we conceptualize human rights along the following lines. One, definitions of human rights. What human rights are, whether human rights as an idea is a heuristic device for analyzing social justice, or whether it is a secular alternative to discriminatory traditions and religious beliefs, or whether human rights are a set of claims or aspirations that individuals and groups assert in order to protect their dignity as humans. But the fundamental question is, what is dignified in any society? The academic discourse on human rights also goes beyond the definitions of human rights to settling differences over the historical origins of human rights. Whether human rights come from Western positivist traditions, or whether, as Joseph M. Okoba, a Ghanaian political scientist, has claimed that there is a distinctively African conception of human rights. The academic discourse on human rights also examines the politicization of human rights in international affairs, etc., etc. But I argue that the way we discuss human rights in the academy is very different from the way human rights are being conceptualized in the parliaments, in the pulpits, in the press, and in the public square and internet cafes across the African continent. I argue that if you look at what has happened on the African continent between 2009 and 2013, human rights are being mythologized as a very dangerous idea brought from abroad and championed by misguided westernized Africans intent on destroying the traditions and cultures of their country. So if I may get a little bit of water because my mouth is getting dry, that in itself is indeed a violation of human rights. And so I argue that there are particular urban spaces, the internet cafes, in the parliaments, in the public square, and in the press. Human rights are being seen as a very dangerous idea that have been brought by Westerners in an imperialist design to destroy African cultural traditions. Human rights are gradually being seen as a metaphor for sexual liberalism. And in that public square, I argue that a new and dangerous nationalism is emerging on the African continent. A nationalism rooted in the idea that uncompromising opposition to all forms of liberal human rights ideas that liberate children, women, and people with sexual orientation should be vigorously opposed as a way of saving the soul of the nation state. In that regard, beneath the academy and beyond the academy, in what I call the public square and the urban spaces, human rights is being considered as a context within which to assert new citizenship. That is, if you oppose human rights for groups with particular sexual orientation, that is a test of citizenship. It is therefore not surprising, I argue, that in 2013, a female minister designate for human rights ministry faced intense scrutiny in the Ghanaian parliament for her liberal views on sexual orientation as the centerpiece of a human's identity. It is also not surprising that in 2009, David Bahati in the Ugandan parliament introduced an anti-homosexuality bill that criminalizes homosexual expressions and imposes imprisonment for 14 years. And what is also very important is that there were large demonstrations not only in the capital city, Kampala, supporting David Bahati's bill, but also a prominent newspaper in Kampala published the names of prominent homosexuals in Kampala, giving out their names and their car numbers in a manner reminiscent of what happened in Rwanda in 1994. I argue that it is in these spaces of human rights conceptualization that we should begin to pay attention. Because it is in these areas, the pulpits, the parliament, the press, and the public square, that the new and dangerous tension of a human rights conceptualization is emerging. And we discuss human rights at great peril if we locate it merely in the peer-reviewed spaces of discourse. In the parliaments, in the press, in the public square, in the internet spaces, these are not peer-reviewed spaces of intellection. And so it is very, very important that we pay attention. Now, how can these tensions over human rights be resolved? Let me conclude by offering two observations. I argue that the dangerous tensions over human rights, particularly the mythologization of human rights as sexual liberalism in the public square in Africa, has not entirely been negative, in the sense that far from drawing gay activism to the ground, it has really made gay activism in many urban areas in Africa very prominent, to the extent that many people in urban Africa are beginning to discuss the history of sexual diversity in many African societies. And the final point that I want to make is that if we want to resolve the tensions that are emerging between what is happening in the public square and what is taking place in the academy, then it is imperative that clergymen begin to move from redemption theology to what I consider to be a human rights protection theology, in which the clergy and the faithful regard human rights in all its forms as central to the definition of a human being's dignity. After all, dignity is associated with humaneness, and it is humaneness that provides perhaps the best context for understanding and affirming what is a sustainable social order on the African continent. I shall continue if you have any questions to pose hereafter. Thank you very much.
Well, Chairperson, colleagues, I want to thank every one of us for being here. My presentation is on human rights in Africa beyond social relativism. In this presentation, this work is still work in progress, because of recent, in putting the paper together, I discovered that there are some lacunas that I need to fill. But that in itself has not removed the trust of the discourse. And I think it is worth listening to today. The need for the construction of an appropriate guide for the organization of African social and political experiences have become compelling today because existing social values are no longer adequate for the survival of our society and the promotion of human solidarity and happiness. Obviously, this had led to led us to seek for a new direction in measuring human conduct and social practice. And also because, as we all know, the diversity of human values and beliefs, which have made it difficult for us to identify which of these values and beliefs are adequate for social engineering. The aim of this paper is to discuss human rights beyond social relativist conception in Africa. The objective clearly is to argue that the relativist conception of human rights is wrong-headed, hence inadequate for social human solidarity and social progress. The motivation generally is as follows. Scholarly efforts have been devoted to the discussion of social values that have implications for the survival of the society, vis-a-vis the recognition of the diversity of human values and beliefs, which have made it difficult to identify the values and beliefs that are adequate for social progress. Those studies, one of which is the human rights discourse, which scholars have argued within the relativist perspective, that the peculiarities of African social, cultural, and historical conditions had made it imperative that the platform against which human valuation should be measured must be constructed to reflect the form of life of the African situation. I've examined what form of social organization would effectively manage this challenge. This study, therefore, challenges the relativist conception of human rights, which is entirely inadequate as far as I'm concerned. Hence, the thrust will be to explore a new direction that we incorporate the universal understanding of human rights in the quest for human values for social progress in Africa, as against the parochial/provincial mentality. The study, therefore, is expected to provide an insight into the examination of human rights in Africa beyond the postulates of relativism, especially with respect to certain exceptions to some aspects of the postulates as a rational approach to the understanding of social relation that is not only cross-cultural, but have the potential of leading to the development of global solidarity and the preservation and promotion of human essence. To aid critical understanding of human rights, this is the framework in Africa beyond social relativism idea, especially to account for certain exceptions to which some aspects of the postulates in African context, insights were drawn from the relativist theoretical notion of human rights. Here, I take the concept of human rights in this form. By human rights, I mean rights which are based on the assumption of a natural law that posits that there are certain immutable rights that belong to man everywhere and which, in virtue of man's humanity, should be secured and guaranteed to everyone. Such rights, as Christiana says, are not rights which are derived from a particular context, social context. Rather, they are rights which belong to man simply because he's a man. Man in quotes. This carries both male and female. Thus, if such rights exist, one could not be denied of them irrespective of culture or race. This is to say that human rights are inalienable. Against this background, some have argued that talks about human rights are monstrous features which inspire false ideas and vain expectations of equality, and as such should be seen as metaphysical views which do not correspond to reality, or at best can be described as a rolling stone that gathers no moss. The assumption here is that human rights grows with the development of human moral consciousness. The main gist of this position is a rejection, clearly, of a universal conception of human rights, or what some have identified as meta-narrative, which imposes ideas on other values, on other cultures. Projecting Cuba's idea, our contention, therefore, is that whatever criteria we employ for the assessment of human rights in Africa should be relevant to their social content. That is Cuba's position. Claude Ake now, following Coban, argued that the Western conception of human rights emphasizes individual rights, whereas what is paramount in Africa is group identity. What this implies is that irrespective of how values are constructed in Africa, what is paramount is that individuals perceive themselves in terms of group identity. Thus, who a person is, as police averse, is conceptualized in terms of kinship system, clan, the tribe, the village, or whatever the specific cultural manifestation of the underlying worldview. Corroborating this position, Claude Ake posits that being is largely communal as are rights in African societies. So the privatization of interest is meaningless and pernicious. It is meaninless in that the communal factor is the essence of the particular existence, and pernicious in the sense that such privatization will imply the dissociation of persons from the context in which morality and integrity are possible. This is to say, in Ake's opinion, the idea of human rights, which is essentially Western, as initially an ideological representation legitimized by values which are aliens to Africa, experience, and in service of interest. irrelevant to Africa. An equally interesting position in social relativism is that human rights can only be constructed within specific socio-cultural context. These have been discussed. Let me go because I want to be careful with the time. We therefore, in this present study, favor the assumption that human rights principles are based on wider networks of beliefs and practices of a society out of which the very fabric of the lives of the people are woven. That is the same position from then. But put differently, as our judgment, beliefs, and ideas are tied to other presuppositions in a given society, given form of life, we can understand whatever they are saying from a relativist standpoint. But we take exception to this mistaken assumption that the diversity of values can lead to rejection of cross-cultural conception of human rights. The fact is that a particular moral claim or judgment is not justified simply because it is said to be relevant to a given social context. Also, it is possible and legitimate to ask for the justification of a moral claim even when we have established the rationale for it in a given social context. So that becomes a problem for the relativist. The assumption is that since human rights are products of a wider network, out of which the fabric of the lives of the people are woven, they should be tolerated. It's not sustainable. The question is, if certain beliefs and practices are to be understood in terms of the role they play in the lives of people and on that basis be tolerated, does it mean that such values and practices are free from critical appraisals? Hydenus, for example, knows that the fact that, for example, it is necessary to tolerate a practice P does not yield the conclusion that those who abstain from forbidding or condemning P must regard P as morally right. The position, therefore, is wrong-headed. The reason is that even if different conceptions of rights are to be located in their context, this does not mean that they must just be so for the society to survive. In fact, such as Sengel argues, such local control is not only inhumane, it also serves as a limiting factor for the realization of societal dreams and the fulfillment of human aspiration. While it may be glorifying to say that with relativists that social context is important in determining a given conception of human rights, it is significant to say that such conception can change as a result of changing circumstances or by reason of our increasing cultural contact with one another. In this paper, before you give me the last note, I have examined human rights in Africa beyond the postulates of the relativist, taking exception to some aspects of them as a rational approach to understanding of social relations that is not only cross-cultural, but will lead to development of global solidarity and the preservation of human essence. It is on the strength of this exception to relativist conception of human rights that diverse human rights conception can be interculturally assessed. I have not in this essay undermined the force of the role social context plays in determination of or development of any social idea or system. Rather, I proceed as the preferring argument shows that social context arguments are limited by the possibility of intercultural interference, thereby making us unable to claim, as O.B. Lawi, a social anthropologist, said, to know everything about man and his environment from the knowledge of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to stand here to present a paper titled A Philosophical Analysis of Human Rights in the Traditional African Society. When I mean traditional African society, I focus on 5 core states, the southeastern states of Nigeria, and they are Abia, Ebonyi, Enugu, Imo, and Abia, Anambra, Ebonyi, Imo, and Enugu State. The picture focused on these particular people. Apart from the fact that there are core Igbo-speaking areas, but there are still some small minor Igbo-speaking areas people found in the states. They have common cultures. First of all, in their communication, because I'm dealing on traditional African society. And these traditional people are predominantly farmers. And for you to communicate, you must do what? Give them a sense of belonging. And communication is very important as far as human rights concerned. And you can communicate anyway, in any form, as far as you communicate. You can use paints, color shocks, charcoal, diagrams, graphics, charts, mosaic, and what have you. As long as it communicates to you, the sender and the communicator, because communication is very important. You must communicate for them to do what? If you really want to motivate them, persuade them to take action, you must communicate in the language they understand. Also, another culture, another common culture among them is what? Feeding, dressing, and what have you. Once you see somebody from that area, they have commonality in what? Dressing. Also in farming, they deal on crops. And these crops are easily found around. And women are mostly farmers there, over there. Women are mostly farmers over there, predominantly. Because farming exercise are being shifted to women. Because most of their men marry, at least, if see a man marrying 2-3 wives, it is the women that cater for the children. Because the man is just there relaxing. At the end of the day, you must do what? Bring back food. After food, any other thing is history. We understand women. They have this unique identity and social activities, such as what? Freedom of what? Speech. And in such a society, you cannot just, mobilize them without the concept of who? The community leaders and some identifiable leaders. That is worthy sons and daughters of such community. You read, because you cannot, no matter how educated you are, you cannot deceive them. They don't even trust you unless you go through those community leaders and those sons and daughters they respect. So it is so dicey dealing with this set of people. And the picture focus on the concept of morality and rights. Let me give you this instance. In such a community, in such a place, if a young woman loses a husband, the elder brothers or the younger brothers who admire the lady can go after her in marriage. That's what happens there. Some educated ones do not yield, but the educated ones, out of ignorance and fear, will easily yield. There's a particular ethics. They have a particular ethics. So for the protection and survival of such communities, they are so, they are so envious of themselves. Anything, you cannot bring any idea there to accept. They are so protective of themselves that those community leaders and whatever must pass must accept those ethics, such as what? A particular ethic that protects their lives and property. That's why sometimes we discover problem in land dispute, which is rare in other areas, but in those core traditional settings, these things are very important. So for you to even pass information through them, and some information could be passed through what? Town criers, depending on the level of audience. Before you, the originator of an idea, whether I want to impact knowledge or persuade them into action, you must do what? You should be very careful. You must come down and identify with them for them to accept you, because it is difficult to interfere in their norms and beliefs, because they've been having that belief ever before you even were born. As some of us sometimes go for research, they will hardly believe in you. Because it is very difficult to do what? To play on someone's psychology. And this very person has been in that community for years. Before you ever impact any knowledge to them, you must pass through their community leaders, or those identical sons and daughters of such community. So, in marriage, for instance, for you, just like when we visited one of the communities in Canada, for instance, once you see a Nigerian, even though we are Nigerians, but once you see somebody from a particular community, you must easily know through his what? Tattoos or motive. In Anambra State, for instance, before you recognize an Anambra man, from his tattoos, you're able to easily identify the person. Is it not true? If you are from Anambra here, the first thing that can really tell an Anambra man is what? His tattoos, his motive here on his forehead. So they guard against those ethics. You cannot just pass anything, because morality and real rights are most important. And those things were craved or created to protect their lives and property. To protect their lives and property. That's why it is really important. Once you want to sell an idea, you must be very careful in the language you use. Don't ever endanger their rights, human rights, in those core traditional African settings. So in this paper, to enhance this paper, I had to use what? Information diffusion theory. This theory, it's just like hypodermic needle theory. For you to pass an information, just like giving somebody an injection, and the injection flows through his nerves. So in information diffusion theory, you must guard against your language, the time and the place, the uniqueness and what have you, for such information to sell, and make sure it does not hinder or bring any challenge in their what? Human rights. Freedom of information sells in such a society. Freedom of information. And before you, that such freedom of society cannot just come. It must pass through some people, some stages before it gets to the final destination. So audience matters. Thank you. Audience matters in such a situation. These people, as I said earlier, are found in the southeastern states of Nigeria. They are predominant farmers. So I conclude by saying that their rights and morality are very important, which cannot be tampered, no matter the government. Thank you.
A very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ijeoma, Nwajiaku, and my paper is titled Echoes of Underdevelopment, Voices from the Niger Delta of Nigeria. Incidentally, I'm a literature person, so I don't know how I'll tell my stories in 10 minutes. But anyway, my paper is looking at the issues from the Niger Delta area, and particularly my concern has been literature by women from the Niger Delta area. My paper is broken into 5 sections. The first one is introduction, and there I begin to look at the issues of underdevelopment versus poverty. You know, how underdevelopment and poverty seem to relate so closely, how a lot of the issues that come up in the third world areas seem to be general and unique, particularly in Africa, for instance. I don't have time to read the paper or the statistics, but to sum up, you know, some of the things that seem to be prevalent, you have high levels of unemployment, you have overpopulation and low standards of health, you have lack of technological skills, you have inadequate growth in national income, you have lack of external resources, you have massive debt burden and balance of payment deficits, unfavorable balance of trade, and all of those things. How does that affect my paper? I begin to look closely at the Niger Delta region. In Nigeria, there's been a lot of militancy, a lot of issues, you know, in the Niger Delta area over time. The Niger Delta area is made up of 6 states: the River State, Cross River State, Edo, Delta, Bayelsa, and Akwa Ibom. Together, these 6 rich oil states constitute what is generally defined, classified as the South-South geopolitical zone in Nigeria, and several of its territories share boundaries with the Atlantic seaboard and the Cameroons and all of that. I'm concerned particularly, like I said, there's a lot of fiction from the Niger Delta, a lot of poetry, a lot of plays, and a lot of prose fiction as well. But I'm looking at 3 novelists from Nigeria. One is from the Niger Delta area. The other 2 are not from the Niger Delta area, but they have also written about the issues that are prevalent in that environment. J.J. Dara, a prominent scholar from the area, says, the political cartography of the Nigerian ruling class, the nations in the Niger Delta area, remain minorities, which must be confined to the margins of power. Now, this is what is predominantly the issue there. These are the states in Nigeria that seem to provide for the nation the oil that is the main source of income for the nation. And when you get to the Niger Delta area, what you have is gross underdevelopment, poverty. And then when you relate this to issues of human rights, they are saying, if we produce the bulk of the resources for this nation, why are we underdeveloped? And there's a lot of media propaganda, such that sometimes you're not even sure what the truth is. It was not until I personally read a novel called Yellow Yellow by Akaine Agari that I began to reflect on some of the issues that she, as someone from the Niger Delta, had presented in her works. And I got really interested to say, could this be the reality? I'm a Nigerian, I live in Nigeria. I know there is a lot of agitation in the environment, but are these really the issues that seem to be troubling the people from that environment? And then I began to pay attention. Dara again says, the vision and trajectory of these movements and actions are to promote a radical change in Nigeria's political configuration so that the nations and peoples who are the victims of local colonization can emancipate themselves. As far as people from the Niger Delta are concerned, they've become victims of local colonialism because they are marginalized in their own country. In their own country, their oil is taken and they are not able to benefit from it the way that they want to. So they have militants, they have people who are rising in opposition, that people who are saying, look, you need to understand we're not just speaking, these things are real. For example, when you read Agari's book, you discover that perhaps because she's female, she's able to look at other issues. I mean, there is the economic aspect, there is the mass poverty, there is the unemployment for young people that are confined to the villages and they don't do anything. And what happens? Because there is so much poverty, so much ignorance, they're not going to school, they take to arms. You know, they kidnap the oil, the people the expatriates who come to drill oil from their environment. But I was also particularly concerned to look at some of the things that she's looking at, apart from the reality of life of poverty, which is real in the Niger Delta area. Agari began to look at another thing that is part of their lives. The novel is titled Yellow Yellow because the protagonist is the result of a temporary affair that an expatriate had with her mother when he came to the Port Harcourt area. Now, what is the effect of this on the people in that environment? A lot of children are what we call half-caste in that environment, because the oil explorers, the people who work in the multinational oil companies, come and make advances to the women. And some of them, like Yellow's mom, actually fell in love with him. She, a young, naive person, and then a white man proposes to her. She's excited, and she gets into a relationship with him. But for him, she's just serving the purpose of his being away from home, being lonely, and being far, far away. And so Yellow is the outcome of that relationship. And of course, when he boards the ship that takes him back to his country, he doesn't ever remember that there was any such person or any such thing in his life. But what happens to the children now? So the women writers are able to introduce this aspect to their literary work. The daughter is going through psychological trauma at diverse levels. She's stigmatized because she's the product of a supposedly immoral woman. And on her own part, she's also suffering from a lack of identity. Who exactly am I? I'm in my village, and I'm whiter than every other person who is black in this environment, so I don't really belong to them because they are black, and I'm not white either. And then in her quest for a father identity, because of the experience for her mom, the woman doesn't talk about the man who is her father. So in a quest for a father figure in her life, she finds herself becoming attracted to an older man because in her subconscious mind, she's seeking a father. But unfortunately, the man happens to be a very wealthy Nigerian, a politician, who is merely looking for very young girls to exploit sexually. So, and that's what happens to her. Again, he exploits her. So it's like a repetitive cycle for her. And then she's traumatized again at a different level. So I was interested in looking at that in my work. And she's called Yellow, like I said before. What are the other issues that the people look for? The other two writers I mentioned, one is Chika Onigwe, if you know her book, The Phoenix, which has gone on to win an award recently, and Sefi Atta's News from Home. I see a situation where, even for Nigerian female writers who live in the diaspora, the issue of the Niger Delta is not something that is forgotten. So News from Home is a collection of short stories, but News from Home is the title of the story in which the writer is again exploring the issue of the Niger Delta. So the young girl who comes to America to work as a housekeeper for a doctor and his wife is concerned and perpetually listening to the radio because she wants to know what is happening back home in the Niger Delta area where she comes from. Again, there is violence, there's eruption of violence, people are dying, young people are being captured and put in prison. And of course, even if she's in America, she wants to know, are my relatives in prison because they're agitating for what is supposedly our rights? And then in Chika Onigwe's The Phoenix, her mother, she had a problem. She lives in Belgium with her husband, but she had a problem. She was traumatized when her child died, and then her husband wants to bring her mom to come over to Belgium to be with her during this trying period. And her mom is not in Enugu where they live because she had to travel to Niger Delta, and she had to go to her place in order to participate in a protest that the women decided we also have to lend our voice to the issues. We have to make our input as women. And then women begin to get actively involved in civil protest. And on that particular day, the police released the tear gas on the women. And that's not something that should happen. And so it has a counterproductive effect and all of that. So basically, what I'm saying is that the issues in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria remain critical. They remain important because so long as they remain in the nation, and so long as the nation feeds so much more from the environment, from the natural resources of the environment than from any other place in the entire country, and so long as they keep feeling marginalized the way that they feel, they are bound to be protests in different ways. Probably a lot of you might have heard of Ken Saro-Wiwa. He was a poet and he died, he was hung along with other people because of his agitation and trying to make the young people in the environment as well as the government to have a dialogue, to say how can we be a part of what is going on in the country. let me give you an example of one of the ways that the oil exploration actually affects the people, particularly in the rural areas in the Niger Delta. Before that, let's see what the writer of Yellow says. She says, the one thing I was certain about was that I wanted to tell the Niger Delta story with a female voice, from the female perspective. At the time, most of the voices coming out of the Niger Delta were male voices, and expectedly, the women's issues were rarely in contemplation. So the female writers are able to look at the critical issues, not just of economics, not of politics, but also other issues like the ones I mentioned that are peculiar to people in their environment. On the day, one of the days that one of the oil pipes burst and the crude oil overruns the entire village, for instance, the writer notes, I watched as the thick liquid spread out, covering more land and drowning small animals in its path. It just kept spreading, and I wondered if it would stop. How far would it spread? Then there was a smell. I can't describe it, but it was strong. So strong it made my head hot and turned my stomach. I bent over and wrecked so hard I became dizzy. There was much oil, and we would do nothing with its viscous oil that would not dry out. Black oil that was knee deep. As if that was not enough, she recollects that that was the day her mother's farmlands were completely destroyed. The farmlands represent the only source of livelihood for this single woman who has no husband, who has to raise her child. With the oil destroying the farmland, what's she to do? She might protest in the village, but is the government hearing her voice? Who is going to carry the voice of this rural woman to the government? And what's going to happen? Sometimes they sit and listen to the radio, and they're hearing sometimes there are scholarships for children, for people in the Niger Delta area. You don't know where you're going to get the scholarship form from. You have no idea what office is going to give you the application forms. And so they just remain in that environment. Whatever it is that we hear on the radio is available to them, does not really get to them in real life. And so out of desperation, out of having nothing to do, the young boys suddenly sometimes just take to arms. And the women take to prostitution. What do we do to break the cycle of poverty? Several of them migrate to Port Harcourt and get into prostitution. And so the young girls' dream of going to school was eroded, even though eventually her mom was able to send her to Port Harcourt and she was able to get beyond that. Now, sometimes they say, we hear how the Ijeoma and other ethnic groups were suffering and even dying while the wealth of their soil-fed orders. These brokers drove the boys in my village to violence. If we had to suffer amidst such plenty, then these boys would cause as much havoc as possible until someone took interest in our plight as they saw it. Some of them joined the boys from other villages to kidnap oil company executives or bar oil workers from doing their job. The story goes on and on and on. At the end of the day, really, the issue is, it boils down to human rights. What exactly is the situation at the moment? So by way of conclusion, I simply say, in conclusion, one can only surmise that the political and economic realities of the Nigerian nation would continue in very significant ways to be affected by the unabating tension in the Niger Delta area. Although the country finally witnessed the emergence of a president from the region, that is a president that is going to vacate office on the 29th of May, the emergence of a president from the region, it is as yet uncertain how his tenure has been able to effect the desired changes in the lives of the people, of the majority poor in the entire Niger Delta region. What this basically means, therefore, is that the activism in whatever form, armed protest, militancy, kidnapping of oil workers, destroying of oil pipelines and all of that, will certainly persist until the gross injustice against the region and area is addressed much more appreciably. Thank you very much.
The title of my paper is Democratic Governance and Human Rights in Central Africa. Specifically, I have chosen here to Central African Republic to be studied. And looking at the time constraint, I am slightly shortening my paper to cover within the time frame as identified by Chair. That the Central Africa actually comprises of 11 republics, namely Angola, Burundi, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Rwanda, and Sao Tome and Principe. So these societies are faced with formidable challenges of democratic governance, human security, human development, and human rights. Plethora of social, economic, and political issues prevalent in Central African countries further complicates the scenario. In this light of the above background, I have made an attempt to study in this paper to investigate the democratic governance and human rights in Central African Republic, CAR, a less talked about but an imperative component of Central Africa. The paper also attempts to look at trends and concerns that have surfaced in the domain of democratic governance and human rights in CAR. A poor, small, ethnically and linguistically diverse Central African Republic has had series of armed conflict, emergence of rebel groups leading to widespread violence, troubled colonial history, and legacy of which is still observed, and distressed process of governance is still questioned. A country where population of roughly 5 million people, 1.5 million are at the risk of starvation today, while 2.5 million are estimated to be in the need of other forms of humanitarian assistance, that is nearly half of the country. So human rights violation is blended with process of ethnic cleansing, quote unquote, whereby whole villages are being emptied and a countryside laid waste. So at this backdrop, it is very essential to make a thorough examination of democratic governance and human rights conditions in CAR, which is surrounded by countries like Chad, Sudan, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and so on and so forth. So it is very clear from different studies that the problem of transfer of power, basically what we are looking at in Central African Republic after its independence from France, that it's a transfer of power from government to a successful opposition leader following an election has been one of the basic impediments to flourishing democracy in much of the African countries, including CAR. So it is a claim that attempts to resolve these issues inter alia are significant in Africa's incomplete metamorphic democracy is to transform into complete metamorphic democracy. The rationale for this approach is based on assumption that at this juncture, CAR, a lack of majority of essential ingredients of a complete metamorphic democracy, such as accountability, legitimacy, orderly change of government, so on and so forth. However, the issue is not so general. It should not be looked into a kind of very generalistic way. The post-colonial CAR has been governed by some more than 8 constitutions, and any one of them is not developed by formally constituted constituent assembly through people's representatives. Actually, we are looking at a kind of very democratic change of government, and we are identified it as very important ingredients of metamorphic democracy. But what type of constitutions are imposed in the country is very important to be looked into. How these constitutions are made, whether constitutions are created by a constituent assembly properly elected with representatives by the people, or whether these are imposed or made in some universities or ivory towers in France. So it's very important to be looked into that these are developed by some professors of law sitting in universities of France, incorporating some inspiring legal theoretical dimensions of democracy, not at all understood by the people for whom these are to be implemented. So understanding the process of democracy at the grassroots, at the very grassroots level is important to look a kind of successful democracy in any territory, what is very important. In this regard, it is observed that the first constitution in CAR was promulgated on 15 February 1959 at a time when the country had not yet attained full sovereignty. The CAR, a member state of French community, was initially given democratic institutions inspired by those of France. Almost all successive rulers of CAR started to dictate their own constitutions directly or indirectly with their own motives to take over different governments. And what we understand that basically constitutions are regarded as the supreme law of the land, and amendments are made there to strengthen the democratic framework and to give rights to the people. Basically, the rights are identified, the basic rights of the people are identified in the democratic constitutions in democratic world. But the opposite picture is identified in case of CAR. All the subsequent constitutions of CAR had a common trait: measures were violated and then legalized. First violated and then legalized. And the author of these violations, with adequate legal help from some constitutional experts, not by the Constituent Assembly, would then be granted supreme power. In this situation, is it expected to attain complete metamorphic democracy in Central African Republic? Okay, thank you. So again, what we find, this is the on this backdrop, what we find that violation of human rights by some rebel groups, for example, Seleka and Anti-Balaka armed groups, are very prominent in this country. So war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other serious human rights violations and abuses have been committed by members of mainly Muslim Seleka forces and mostly Christian Anti-Balaka armed group with total impunity. So what we find that though so many constitutions are developed in this country, but nowhere it is found that these groups or representatives are incorporated in its history to formulate the various provisions of the constitution, which is very dangerous in the process of making democracy as a kind of top-down approach in this country. So what is observed, that again I am looking at just jumping out because of the time constraint, that because of poverty, which is again another important dimension of this country, that poverty throughout the Central African Republic is widespread. Not only is it one of the poorest countries of the world, where 1 in 10 children die at birth and 1 in 5 children are dead before their 5th birthday. It's also one of the world's poorest school enrollment, and nearly all the country's population are affected by decades of conflict and war. It's very, very important to be looked into. So, yeah, in this context, various important theoretical assumptions of democracy or democratic governance and human rights are very important, and where we find that democracy flourishes when the citizens and the most marginalized sections of the society have the potential to participate in the process of governance and seek accountability from the state. Democracy becomes meaningful when people can shape the state, and the state in turn creates a kind of enabling social, political, economic and legal conditions wherein people can exercise their rights and archive freedom from fear and want. So quality of democratic process depends on the capability and integrity of the organs of the state, where everything is violated. Educational level is very poor, illiteracy is there, no literacy programs are successful, and at the same time the institutions, democratic institutions are failed. Institutions are made in a kind of very undemocratic way, and democracy where involves dignity, multiplicity, diversity, and progress, which is not found here. And at last, but not the least, I would like to submit that unless the most marginalized sections of the society feels a sense of dignity through different institutional mechanisms and so many things, unless the most marginalized sections of the society feels a sense of dignity and involves them in the process of governance, democracy become futile. Thank you.
Being with us. So this time I'm going to try to make sure I go in order. Professor Kissi started with a very provocative idea of seeing human rights as, of places in Africa where human rights campaigns are seen as a sexual liberalization. And that was very provocative for me, especially since yesterday I was guarded in court for about 4 hours waiting to testify on a human rights case, on a political asylum case. So I just thought that was a great way to start our panel. Dean Ebijuwa had an interesting proposition for us, suggesting that possibly we could resolve the dichotomy between this universal basis for human rights versus this intent by some of trying to say that you have to keep those human rights in context. So certainly I thought that was another great way to move. Then Professor Ijeoma Nwajiaku, did I say? Chukwu. You, of course, took us in the literature, which is great to take stories. But one of the questions that you posed that I thought was very provocative for our panel of conceptualizing human rights, you asked, can people from the Niger Delta emancipate themselves? So human rights coming from, the grassroots. And you ended by saying, what do we do to break the cycle of poverty? So linking poverty to human rights. Professor Christiana, Chukwu, you had a really great way of asking and provoking a different line of thought, suggesting that no matter how we study human rights or what kind of ideas we have about human rights, there is something very important of following traditional lines of power by going first to traditional community leaders. And so I thought that was also a great place to go. And then Professor Sarmah, you did a fantastic job also finishing up the panel for us. You are looking at the link between human rights and democracy, of course. I always love, for those of you who don't know, I'm French, so I always love an attack on those French professors in their ivory towers. I certainly appreciate the comment that constitutions should not be imposed by people sitting in France. I agree, they should be here at the conference with us. But very importantly, you talked about accountability, and which was one of the topics that our panel had not yet taken on. So I think we've got a really great breadth of topics, of views, and of expertise, and of studies from all of our panelists. Please, let's open to questions, and then if our presenters would grab so that we can have better.
I thought your presentation was interesting about the Niger Delta, but I was not sure about the discussion of the yellow, and the young lady who was biracial. What did her story have to do with the quest for human rights? I didn't get that part. And then for the first few speakers who were talking about the cultural relativism versus the historical specificity and the nation-state paradigm, etc. In the realms of international law and international relations, nation-states rather than supranational organizations such as the United Nations and the International Court of Justice are considered to be the arbiters and determiners of the citizenship rights, duties, and obligations. So when you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have all these International Court of Justice, all these organizations that are supposed to be hunting down these people who are committing all these atrocities. How do we really adjudicate this when the nation-state concept is still so viable and so impactful, and that the United Nations has all these resolutions on the books that are collecting dust that have never actually been implemented? And we put economic sanctions in place. We send people over to, military to do this. We try to assassinate leaders to get them out of office if they're doing inappropriate things. So what is the status of this whole complex issue with regard to adjudicating and really handling human rights violations?
Yellow Yellow is incidentally the title of a novel, but the protagonist, the lead character in the story, is also called Yellow Yellow. Now, what I was doing was looking at 3 narratives from the Niger Delta by women. I wanted to get the perspective of the women, and so that's where the story of the biracial girl comes in. So the question is, she's just representative. The Niger Delta issue is a much larger thing than she is projecting. The question is, how do we benefit from what is endowed in our region? The oil is deposited, the natural resources that gives Nigeria the bulk of its wealth is actually located in their environment, and they are not able to benefit from it. So they look at themselves as victims of local colonialism. You know, the oil comes from the Niger Delta region, but there's a lot of poverty, a lot of deprivation, and the children are not able to go to school. So because they're cut off from whatever is the wealth of Nigeria, the young people resort mainly to violence. You know, so the idea is, we want to be a part of, is our right, is our basic human right to go to school. We're not able to go to school. It's our right to be able to eat. We're not able to eat. We're not even able to drink water. Because when the oil spills and overruns all the water around there, the fish dies, you know, all the fishes die off, because this is a predominantly fishing area because of the water they have there. So the fish dies as a result of pollution. The farmlands are overrun. You don't have access to them. And so the quest for human rights is on all levels. We just need to have our voices heard. We need to be liberated from this. We need to have our environment developed predominantly with the money that comes from our area. As a matter of fact, I think things are changing a little bit because of the agitation and all of that. So recently, in the allocation of resources in Nigeria, quite a significant portion of the money goes to the 6 oil-rich states. So eventually, maybe things will begin to change for them. Thank you.
Please, then I'll come back again. Let me add to what Ijeoma is saying. I want to say also that as somebody who is from the Niger Delta region, specifically from Warri, where you have the refinery and where you have a larger part of the agitation, I want to differ a little bit from what she has just said, because I know that there are some other bigger issues that are responsible for some of this agitation, because those things were not there before. In the early 80s, we never experienced this form of agitation. So there must be an overarching problem that is responsible for this type of problem that we have seen now, because we have not been able to interrogate the internal contradictions in the Niger Delta region, which is equally very important. Because the fact that you have those oil companies there, oil and gas companies, is not, it should be a blessing rather than a curse. Mm-hmm. Because as it is, the political elites have failed in their business. That is one aspect of it that is responsible for the problems that we have there. That the second aspect is that there is a dislocation of the value system in that environment, which has made the youth, rather than proceed in doing things that will put them in the right place, have shifted from the right path, sometimes into what I call their social and ethnic enclaves, to seek for social fulfillment that is not there. If the political allies have done their job as they should, some of these problems that we have would not have arisen. So that's the major problem. It's not that the government is not doing what they're supposed to do. Sometimes they pay money to the traditional rulers. You remember, there is a particular traditional rulers that was killed by his own people in the Urobo community. He was even tied to a truck and was dragged along the street and was killed because he collected money from the shell company and did not do what he was expected to do with the money. So that aspect also, we should look into it, because we have internal contradiction responsible for this crisis. It started with the kidnapping of oil workers, the white workers. But it has shifted now to even the parents of the political elite. They have all removed their parents from the villages. Even in the East, most people don't go home for Christmas, which is usually the practice, because their parents are vulnerable to this type of thing. So it's gone beyond the issue of oil, because there's ecological fund that is being given to the governors all the time. These are in billions, but they are not spending the money, and we have not been able to question them. So we need to go beyond what is happening there, because there are internal contradictions that we all know. Until we interrogate those contradictions, we will not go far. Thank you.
Being an extreme paradox, particularly in the area of accountability and Jayanta's argument about citizen participation in human rights. If you look at the demonstrations in Kampala, if you look at a mob in Lagos claiming that it wanted to arrogate upon itself the destruction of all homosexuals as a social purification exercise. In Ghana, mobs besieging the president's office, calling for the destruction of homosexuals as an exercise in social hygiene. Then you realize that citizen participation, particularly on issues of human rights, is gradually constructing the state not as a political structure, but as a moral unit. And the very moment citizens push a reconceptualization of the state as a moral unit, the citizen participation, particularly in areas of human rights, is counterproductive. Herein lies the contradiction, particularly in that relationship. Another contradiction also is to the degree that human rights are being seen, as I call in the urban square, as a discourse that has a relationship with global citizenship and international justice. To the degree that people come to see human rights as a framework for hauling African leaders in front of the ICC, if you look at all the 8 cases on the docket now, they are all African cases. And so it raises fundamental questions about whether Africans constitute an errant race. And so it are these issues of the relationship between human rights and international jurisprudence that is also leading to a paradoxical view of human rights, particularly in what I call the urban square, as a framework for constructing an ideology of African moral exceptionalism. And so particularly on the issue of sexuality as central to human rights, what is emerging, particularly in many African societies, is a strong opposition to universal human rights conceptions, in opposition to a view that is emerging in urban Africa, that Africans are morally exceptional to the West. I find that to be, outlandish. But my concern as a scholar of human rights is actually to look at these contradictions that human rights intellection is spawning. Just one last point. I think as African scholars, we need also to do a lot more comparative studies of African human rights conceptions. I do not find it satisfactory that one can posit an African conception of human rights based on the study of values within one particular country. It can be 6 ethnic groups, but to the extent that it is the study of 6 ethnic groups and their values within Nigeria, within Zambia, within Malawi, it is not enough to stretch it from there and generalize it as an African conception of human rights. And what has become fashionable in the way we study human rights is that we take the Zulu Ubuntu ethic and then generalize it as an African conception of human rights. We take a Akan conception of human rights and then we generalize it as African conception of human rights. I think we have come to a point where we need to do broad-based comparative studies of human rights from Cape Town to Cairo before we make conclusions like that.
Question is, Professor Kissi, how do in places like Uganda, where you have this strong evangelical Christian push against this human rights thing, and you mentioned the pulpit being one of these public spaces. How do they reconcile that the religion that they're practicing, and particularly the way that they're practicing it, is Western? And so if human rights is bad because it's Western and control, how, and you're doing this with your Pat Roberts, poster in the back, I don't understand. How do they reconcile that is my question.
Experiencing in Africa is what I call human rights reductionism. I mean, we criticize the West for a selective application of human rights in international affairs. But we are also practicing a selective emphasis on human rights. That is, what human rights is depends on who you ask in the Niger Delta, depends on who you ask in Uganda. And what is interesting is this not contradictory, that as Africans, we look at Protestant Christianity as the centerpiece of African culture. I find it mind-boggling. Because if you look at the history of Buganda in the 1890s, missionaries who went there have written that in fact in the Kabaka's palace, there were chamberlains who were actually men. And so the missionaries, the British missionaries, were the first to actually criminalize and raise laws against what they call unnatural carnal knowledge. So if we really do our homework very well as African scholars, and I'm challenging myself and all my colleagues who have come, it is now time for us to do serious scholarship, in my view, on our histories and anthropologies. Now that human rights discussions in Africa is creating dangerous tensions, where people, clergymen, are speaking like the Nazis did in Nazi Germany. We have to go back and look at the history of Buganda. We'll be very surprised about the institutionalized history of sexual diversity. Let us look at our own proverbs and sayings that underscore the complexity of sexual expressions in Africa long before the arrival of the Europeans. And so here we have become more Catholic than the Pope. Here are Africans in Uganda who are defending Protestant Christianity as integral to African culture. In a sense, they have no clue what their own culture is. And herein lies that contradiction.
Ijeoma, that was a good one. But as we were talking, I started raising some questions. And I asked, what can be done to put a stop to the feelings of marginalization in Niger Delta? Yes, we come up with a lot of talks, we present papers, but can we come up with solutions to these issues so that at the end of the session we come up with this communique that will pass to all African countries and to every other country that is concerned. We talked about the voices that have not been heard. How can these voices be heard? What can be done? Or do we still talk about it, write novels, keep on writing novels, and at the end of the day, the issue is still there? Because you said that the protest will continue until the unjust treatment is addressed. Then how do we address these unjust treatments? Thank you.
I think the solution lies in education. The second one is accountability. If our political elites are made to be accountable for the resources at their disposal, then things will change. And the change that we are talking about, we just experienced a few days ago in Nigeria. Because of this level of degradation and the psychological torture that has developed as a result of the distance between the rich and the poor, the Nigerian society have decided that those who have been their devourer should give them a space. And by the same token, there's a big challenge for the incoming administration if they also did not take the bull by the horn. Because the Nigerian society now is now politically aware of their rights to self-determination. The real problem is not that the state called Nigeria is poor. Nigeria is a blessed state, a blessed country. But the problem is that our leaders have not been doing the right thing. And if they, by reason of the decision of last week, take the bull by the horn, most of this problem will be eradicated. The problem of emancipation you are talking about started in the late 80s. In the early 80s and before that, the situation was not like that. And then I also want to interrogate the actual, I think you spoke as a feminist. But the other aspect that I also want to remind you about, very many of us here seated from the Niger Delta region, it was very difficult in those days for a male to woo a female in the environment. You can ask a lady out for 1 year, the lady will not tell you yes. Because of our values that were ingrained in the consciousness of the people. But those values have been dislocated as a result of poverty created by, not necessarily civilization. Civilization does not mean that people should prostitute. Because the concept of prostitution now is not only tied to those who are poor, because there are children of rich people that are equally involved in that mess. So we cannot take it like that. It is not only the poor people that go into criminality, because there are children of rich people that are criminals. The problem is the dislocation of values in the environment. And that's important. Until we address that, until we interrogate that, we will continue to have that problem. But as I speak, I am not a member of the APC, but I can see some sense in what those people are saying. If you look at the APC states in Nigeria, even if they are not getting it right, but there is a modicum of infrastructural development in the APC states, because I live and work in one of the states and I see what they are doing, are different from those states that have resources bigger than them. Thank you.
Diverse Africa is. So if in your part of Nigeria, men would have been more hesitant in their approach to women, and I come from a matrilineal society where the dignity of the woman is located at the center of the social structure. But remember the trial of Jacob Zuma in 2010 for raping a subordinate. You know the argument his lawyers advanced, that in his culture, it is within the realm of a man's dignity to satisfy an aroused woman or to do something similar when a man finds himself alone with a woman. Now, this appeal to culture as a defense, and this, the degradation of women in the context of culture may not be happening in Nigeria, but what is happening in matrilineal Nigeria and matrilineal Ghana is not the same as patrilineal South Africa. So when we speak about Africa, we have to be very careful not to homogenize the context from our own specific experiences. That's the point I want to make.
I believe that this panel is a great one because we have learned from them. Now, I agree with my colleagues who presented something of human rights, that African scholars will have a great job to do in relation to the conceptualization of human rights. Because when we divide human rights into both academic and public spaces, we are going to discover that even in those spaces, there are arguments and counter-arguments, which means that there's no disagreement. There's no agreement, I mean. But you see, I think liberalism as a political theory has done a lot of, maybe some good, some bad, in relation to politics, for example. And I can just imagine if we go down memory lane and we look at what is politics or what is political, we are going to discover that politics is about service to humanity. And given the fact that there are criteria that actually guides serving people, but we have actually deviated from those criteria. And so everybody is just doing his or her own thing to satisfy his or her own ego. If it is possible for us to revert back to that core value that can define what human rights are, then maybe we can start to actually move forward in relation to human rights issues. My second comment relates to Ijeoma. Yes. Okay, I just want to share with you a contrasting reaction to what you said about yellow. Now, a common thing among what I want to say is that exploitation. For example, when those oil explorers actually came, definitely we know that they are coming outside Nigeria. Maybe they are Western nations. And what they usually do is that they have a lot of money, they have a lot of influence. And so our ladies, definitely they are attracted to them. And because they do not have any commitment, they just did what they did and living for their country. The same thing happened during the plantation system in the Caribbean. Because those slave masters, they were equally coming from the West. And what the oil explorers did to our women in the Niger Delta was exactly what these slave people actually did to women in the Caribbean. And so when they left, some of the children were also light-skinned. But the difference that I want to share with you is that within the Nigerian context, we are thinking that we have lost a kind of identity because maybe some people might be looking at us as a jacket child or as a bastard. The same thing happens in the Caribbean. Formerly, they look at such children as jackets. That is the term that they usually use. But with time, they have actually transcended that kind of attitude. You see, in the Caribbean today, those people who are light-skinned are the people that get the best job in the society. Those white-skinned ladies are the people that get the best men in the society. They work in. So you can see the contrast. So they are no longer looking at themselves as bastards or whatever. They have even made a law against calling a child a bastard. The moment that you are a child, you are a legitimate child, no matter what happened. So maybe one can learn a lesson about yellow kind of experience from what you have said. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we have to end here. Thank you for your comments. Thank you, everyone, today for being at our panel. We'll see you at dinner in just a little bit. Thank you.